So I might not be the talk for it, but I thought about coming in, in camo.
Skillet.
Inappropriate for church, I'm into it.
I believe the right.
Yeah. A shame, but
It's a shame.
I know, you have to do what you can do, right?
Like dressing up as the devil. So that's not really the place.
Unless there's like an organized event where like I'm slain by someone dressed as St. Michael or something.
Hello, sorry to bother you. Were you expecting an interpreter?
Oh, right. We tried.
Sorry.
Christopher. We tried to get an interpreter, but unfortunately on the notice we had, we weren't able to bring one in. But what we do have, which you can follow along with, is a backup.
I've secured one.
You've secured one.
Whoever's organised it.
Apparently we tried to organise one, and one says that she was coming. I believe that she was. But as James just said, short notice, she's not coming. I did send you.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
are you able to follow?
Yes, I would be able to. No, not really. But, it depends on the presentation. There may be some questions, and that I'd like to ask. And, it's easier for me to have an interpreter, otherwise I have to really focus.
Yeah. We do have a script to hand if you want to take it as well, which can help you follow along.
I do have the. Is it in PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have it. It was emailed to me.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's no interpreter today.
Unfortunately not, no.
I'm not surprised because it's very short notice.
Yeah.
Normally we need.
This is the person who you're talking to, my wife.
Yeah.
Are you an interpreter?
No,
Oh, no.
unfortunately not.
No, sorry, no.
Oh, sorry.
I'm the person who's been talking to you.
That's me. Thank you.
And you.
That's right.
I'm really sorry that it's fallen through.
Unfortunately, the interpreter's not coming.
No, James has said,
Yeah, so,
if I'd known, I would have put it on Facebook, but I didn't know.
That's right. I mean, I know it was very short notice because I've only just joined your Facebook group.
Yeah.
And normally it would take 2 weeks, maybe more, to secure an interpreter. They are difficult to get hold of.
Right, I didn't know that.
We'll know now. Thank you very much.
It's a lesson learned for next time.
Yeah,
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay.
I know who to
Thank you
contact
very
as well, so that helps. Mic check, mic check. Can people in the back hear me clearly? Can I get a thumbs up from people in the back if you can hear me clearly? I'm getting a wavy head. Hold on. Is this better? Or is that too much? We're good. Okay, excellent. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Hull Minster for this next edition of our Heritage Talks series. Many of you have been to our Heritage Talks before, and if you are a repeat offender, welcome back. For those of you who are new to Heritage Talks, and I'm seeing a few new faces here, this is a program, a series of talks that we're running every other Friday in the chancel at lunchtime, same place, with a breadth of historians speaking to us, some social media historians, some academics, some just local people who really have a passion for history they want to share with you. And today's subject is one I'm really interested in, especially since this speaker has spoken with us before. He did his last talk here on body snatching, if anyone was here or remembered that. Very interesting talk. And this guy's an expert on what he terms all things grotesque. So, friend of Hull General Cemetery, Pete Lowden, is your speaker. It's about the rise and fall of Hull General Cemetery. I won't take up any more of his time because you're here to see him and not me. So, thank you all for attending, and hopefully you enjoy. Cheers. Oh, and give him a hand.
Thank you, James. I'd just like to point out that this structure needs your help. So, although the talk is free, it would be nice if when you left, you slipped some coins into those boxes at the end. None of it goes to me, sadly, but this place needs a lot of maintenance. Right, off we go. As James just said, this talk is about Hull General Cemetery. It was the first and only private cemetery in Hull. The talk is not about the individuals who were buried there. Let's make that clear. That's the whole of the talk. This is the life story of a particular institution, a never to be repeated experiment in Hull. Right, one of my favourite maps, Goodwill and Lawson, 1842. Hull at that time was undergoing a great change, mainly due to the Industrial Revolution. Things were happening. Docks were being built, railways were coming to the town, steamships were trading. It was really a boom town and a boom town. The old walls had been knocked down to build the docks, and the town was spreading out, northwest, west, to the north, very little to the east, but we don't talk about the east side of the river. We don't go there. One of the greatest changes was population. England's population rose from 8.66 million in 1801 to 16.77 million by 1851. So this led to significant social problems: housing, sanitation, crime, poverty, etc. Not the least of these problems was the disposal of the dead. In Hull, the population rose from 30,000 approximately in 1801. So imagine you can actually fit the entire population of Hull into the MKM Stadium. By 1831, it rose to 52%, a 73% rise in 30 years. It topped 100,000 by 1861. And of course, going along with the rising population, the mortality rate increased as well, especially amongst the very young. And that stayed very high for a long time. So where are all these dead people buried? The red dots on the map note the churchyards of the parish churches. Holy Trinity, and we're sat in the middle of it, outside was the burial ground. St Mary's on Lowgate, just further up. Also across the river was St Peter's in Drypool, and just off the map to the north was St Mary's in Schullcoats. They were the parish churches, and they were the burial grounds from the medieval period up until the first one would have been Trippett Street, 1777. Right, the black dots represent the burial grounds of both of the parish churches, e.g. Holy Trinity and St Mary's. The Holy Trinity burial ground has been transformed at this very moment. It was situated on Castle Street. It was 3 acres in size, and it was opened in 1783. The Trippett Street one is at the back of the Charter House, Master's House, and that was approximately 1/4 acre, and that was bought for 5 shillings from the corporation. So that was full by the 1800s. Castle Street was probably full by the 1820s. Other denominations mentioned on the map, or seen on the map, sorry, buried their dead in vaults under their places of worship. These are the pale blue dots. Other Anglican churches that were built were out, to serve the suburbs outside the old walled town, also had burial spaces underneath. These are the yellow dots. The orange dot is the site of the second Jewish burial ground, and finally the green dot represents the Quakers' burial ground in Hodgson Street. In 1853 there was, I'll use the word interaction, between 2 local councillors. It doesn't matter what political parties they were, they obviously hated each other, and they were discussing an issue which was rather prevalent at that time. Their argument was whether the burial ground in St Mary's on Lowgate was 5 foot above the level of the pavement or 8 foot. The reason why the burial grounds had risen so much was because they had nowhere else to put the dead. And so they continued to bury take a coffin out, put another coffin in, then when the few people had gone, put the old coffin back on top, a scattering of soil. Right. And please note, this is 6 years after the formation of Hull General Cemetery, which opened in 1847. So, can you imagine the problems issuing from this site? And it was not alone. Rats and pigs were frequently turning up the dead because they were buried so shallowly. The site was cleaned up in early 1860s by the Reverend John Scott. His idea of clearing the site was to have it levelled, including the human remains and coffins, and then carted and dumped onto Trippett Street. Naturally enough, the corporation weren't impressed, and they took a dim view, as did the public, to no avail, and the corporation had to tidy it up. John Scott himself took the trouble to be buried in Hull General Cemetery. But in fairness to him, he was just following the lead of the Vicar of Holy Trinity, who did exactly the same 20 years earlier in the 1840s. And this human refuse was dumped on a site called Porter's Gardens, now known as the site of the cenotaph. The Hull Packet of February 1845 reported this story and how a reporter questioned a little boy who had gone there to collect wood for the fire at home. When he returned home, his mother inspected the contents of his basket and found coffin wood and human bones inside. According to the reporter, and this quote is almost straight out of Charles Dickens, the boy said, "Surely I have not got the bones of my dear father." Anyway, he may have done, I don't know. So this lack of dignity for the dead led to a nationwide public disquiet. This cartoon shows how the people thought the dead were being treated. And you may notice, I don't know whether that will work on this. Work? No, I've got to do it on there. No, it won't work on there. Bodies stacked up. Bodies in the crypts, bodies stacked up. Goes a bit beyond the basement levels of the houses next door. So it's quite bad. Obviously, well, I believe it probably wasn't as bad as that, but I don't know. The Hull Packet of November 1844 stated that a gravedigger in the graveyard of Holy Trinity Church was observed, when engaged in his vocation, to hold up a human head by the hair. There are many other stories on this similar theme. So, Hull General Cemetery to the rescue. The fundamental idea behind the rise of the Garden Cemetery, and Hull General Cemetery was deemed to be one, was that of treating the dead with dignity, yet also providing a pleasing place to spend some time. Got to remember, Hull didn't have any public parks at that time. If you wanted to go out into the country, yes, it wasn't that far, but there's a lot of country smells out there. The nearest thing to a public park would be a cemetery. So, non-denominational burial was a significant factor in the rise of the Garden Cemetery in Britain. And the clue is in the name General. It took all faiths. Every faith could be buried in Hull General Cemetery, as long as you had the money. By the use of the joint stock mechanism, private investors began to open cemeteries throughout the country. The aim was to make a profit, but couched in lofty, idealistic language. Sir John Dean Pole, an early investor in Kensal Green Cemetery in London, which is one of the Magnificent Seven, Highgate, you'll have heard of, Nunhead, Brompton. There's 7 Abney Street, Abney Road, in Stoke Newington. There's 7 wonderful cemeteries. They're known as the Magnificent Seven, and Kensal Green was one. In fact, it was the first one. Sir John Dean Pole said at a public meeting in 1833 that, and I quote, "It was obvious that when land was purchased at £180 per acre and then sold by the foot, the profit would be considerable." He was later found to have been guilty of fraud and served some time in prison. But he was a banker after all, so what do we expect? I'd love to claim this chap as a distant ancestor. His name is John Claudius Lowden. But sadly, I don't think he is. 1783 to 1843. He provided the blueprint for garden cemeteries in his book on the laying out, planting and managing of cemeteries. Sadly, I have a copy. Indeed, he was a visionary who believed that once the cemetery was full, it should be used as a park. Right. Here's a tithe map of parts of Cottingham, 1838. And no, don't wait. That line is Springbank West. That line is Princess Avenue, Queen's Road, Newland Avenue. Right? Nothing built, 1838, nothing built at all. We'll come to that, a smaller aspect of that map in a moment. But, yes, Hull General Cemetery Company was registered as a company in March 1845, and the board attempted to raise capital for a share offer. They offered 1,000 shares, 1,000 shares at £10 each. £10 in 1846 was quite a large money. 1845 was quite a large amount of money. However, it was massively oversubscribed, mainly because people thought, here's a way in which I can make some money. And this was before the cemetery company had even acquired a site, never mind that the cemetery had not been developed. There was a great scope for investment in those days. If you think about how the railway companies were heavily invested, people bought shares in the railway companies and made a lot of money. People bought shares in water companies and made a lot of money at that time. Cemeteries was just another area of public utility in which people thought they could make a fortune. So, the land to the cemetery, to be the cemetery, was bought from Henry Broadley in 1846 for £5,560 and 5 shillings. Henry Broadley was a great landowner. He was an MP for Beverley, but he was a great landowner in the East Ridings, and it was said at the time that what you could do is you could walk across the East Riding without setting foot off Henry Broadley's land. So the cemetery company paid this 5,000 plus. And this was to be paid in annual instalments over 5 years, plus 4% interest per annum. The company failed to do this regularly, which led to problems when Henry Broadley died, and we'll come to that later. The land at the time was in Cottingham Parish, and the area bought was 19 acres, 1 rood and 13 perches, or thereabouts. Now, I'm sure that you all remember that from the back of your exercise books at school. Chains and furlongs and stuff like that. It's now 7.82 hectares, which is just as much a mystery to me as the perches and roods. There are other sites investigated for the potential cemetery. 2 are on the east side of the river, both of which were discounted quickly. One was on Marfleet Lane, one was on Dansom Lane. Another one, owned by John Webster, was also looked at. However, the owner wanted more money than they wanted to pay, and after investigation, the drainage was worse, so the Derring Bank site of Henry Broadley was chosen. So they were looking at that area there first, but that had bad drainage. And of course, if you're digging down a lot, you really want good drainage. So, the Webster option, which I've just pointed out, became Pearson Park. Wilkinson's map of Hull 1848 is showing for the first time the cemetery is laid out by John Shields and Cuthbert Broderick. John Shields had been the first superintendent of York Cemetery when it opened in the 1830s. He applied for the post at Hull and was quickly snapped up. And I've likened this in the past to Hull City buying David Beckham when he was good. He was really good. In fact, all of the municipal cemeteries in Hull owe their compartmentalisation and their layouts to John Shields, who was also buried in Hull General Cemetery, and his stone was demolished later, but never mind. Beverley at one time tried to poach him when they were laying out their cemetery. and they were warned off, although Shields did give guidance to Beverley. Shortly before the cemetery officially opened, the company had spent over £4,000 just on drainage and planting. And by March 1847, the local press reported excitedly that, and again I quote, already upwards of 3,000 ornamental trees, deciduous and evergreen, and shrubs have been planted, together with 100 of the newest and best sorts of standard roses. As I've said, the cemetery at that time could be used as a public park. And the Victorians had a different mindset towards death. They quite embraced the idea about it, and they made a fetish of it, really. And they would go along and look at headstones and sob quietly, and then move along and look at another headstone and sob quietly. So, this is some of the entries for the first page of the burial register. And it's a very detailed layout. And it's quite a significant historical record, and Hull History Centre has it all on microfilm if you'd like to go and look at it. As you can see, it's numbering, gives you the compartments, gives you the grave numbers, gives you the name, gives you their age, gives you the person what relationship they were to the person who's reporting it, the sex, where they lived, the cause of death, which is very, very interesting, and then the signature of the minister who's officiating. So it's really, really detailed and really useful. If you want to do some social history on the Victorian and Edwardian period, that's the place to start with. Yeah. And, luckily, as part of the project for the Friends of Hull General Cemetery, and I remember standing on a platform in 2019 and saying, what we're going to do is digitalise it and put it in Excel, and then we'll put it on a website, and then everyone can look at it, and that'd be great. You don't need to go to History Centre, get the microfilm out, blah, blah, blah. That was 2019. It was finally finished last year. It was a bit bigger than what we thought. But there we are. It's done, I know, and it's free. Once again, it's free. There's no charge. You can go along and find your ancestors, or check up Zachariah Pearson, or any of the other big names who are buried in Hull General Cemetery, and you can find out exactly where they are and what they died of, and things like that. Very interesting. So, right, you've seen this before. The first burial took place in April 1847. Eliza Smith. Her headstone has been removed. Mr. Smith approached the cemetery company chairman, John Solomon Thompson, roughly down Whitefordgate, because Mr. Smith was part of the Maris, Willow and Smith branch of draperies, who had a large premises at the top of Whitefordgate, roughly where Thornton's chocolate shop used to be. He approached John Solomon Thompson personally to allow the burial of his daughter, who was aged 2 years and 8 months, and she died of slow fever, and if you have an interpretation of that, I'll be happy to hear of it. The board allowed the burial after conferring with John Shields, and it took place in the unconsecrated part of the ground, because they divided up the ground into consecrated and unconsecrated, and there was also Catholic parts, and there was various other parts. At one point, the Jewish cemetery was being closed in 1855, and they wanted to have a part of the Hull General Cemetery, but that fell through because the Jews wanted a separate, apparently the Jewish cemeteries needed a separate entrance to the Gentiles, and it would have meant that General Cemetery would have to knock down some of their buildings in the corner where Welbeck Street is now, and so they didn't pursue that. Anyway, at that time, no part of the ground was consecrated. It wasn't until October 1847 that the Bishop of Bangor consecrated the ground. And one of the hold-ups was that the established church wanted a hedge to divide the consecrated and unconsecrated parts of the ground. And I have difficulty with this because I'm thinking, surely there's only one God, but there we are. On the 30th of April, the first of many impressive funerals that the cemetery saw took place. This was of the stonemason. I believe it's Mr. Cormack. He was only a young man. What was he? 24. Live fast and die young in the Victorian period. The newspaper reports that his coffin was carried by his workmates 200 strong all the way from his home in Carr Lane through the centre of the town up Springbank to the cemetery. So the cemetery was officially opened by the mayor, Boswell Middleton Jalland. I just like saying that name, it's such a good name. And it was opened in June 1847. However, it struggled. This was probably due to its burial charges, which were significantly more expensive than its competitors, e.g. Holy Trinity, Castle Street, etc. However, it received a welcome boost from an unlooked source in 1849, cholera. In the late summer of 1849, just 2 years after its opening, the cemetery proved invaluable to Hull when the town was hit by the second cholera pandemic to attack Europe. After the cholera died out, and it stretched from roughly late June to early October, after the cholera died down, 3% of the population of Hull had died from it. The cemetery buried over half of the victims. Some of them were buried in Castle Street. John Ward, famous marine painter, he's buried in Castle Street. I don't know where his grave is, and it may have been removed, but he died of cholera. And there is still a large obelisk in the cemetery, commissioned by the cemetery company, and placed on the burial site of many of the victims, commemorating their loss. And the council revamped it in 2002, so it's still okay. Actually, the cemetery company, though, didn't pay. It was provided by public subscription, and their stonemason, who was based in Aberdeen, he provided the stone for the monument. So the cemetery company got the credit, but they never paid a penny. Right. The structures of the cemetery, and they're no longer there. None of them exist apart from one. It's a lovely image, that, isn't it? Bevan's lithograph, 1848. The funeral going in, there's the lodge. Steam engine. That is the dead house, because they had an arrangement with the workhouse that if someone died at the workhouse, they would send a hearse to pick up the body and take it and place it in what they call the dead house, the mortuary. Eventually, the employees complained about this, and what they did was they provided another place. There's the chapel. There are no photographs of the chapel in its wonderful state, sadly. There's a photograph later on what to show you. It was taken in 1977, I believe, which shows the chapel in a very disused state. But that is what I like that. I really do like that. Anyway, where am I? As mentioned, the cemetery was opened in 1847, but many of its structures, which would ultimately embellish the site, took some time to be in place. The lodge was built first, closely followed by the chapel. The lodge cost £1,000, and the chapel was £500. In the stonemason's yard, the cemetery had a steam engine installed to keep the water level in the cemetery at a suitable level. It was also used to cut the stone for the headstones, because they had their own cemetery company headstones. If you wander around Hull General Cemetery and look at some of the curb sets, etc., you may see cemetery company inscribed at the bottom. And it was quite a little money spinner for them. In fact, later on, when they had an offer from the Hull Corporation to buy it, they were quite happy to sell the cemetery, but they wanted to keep the cemetery company stonemason yard on their own. Corporation wouldn't wear that, and that deal fell through, much to the cemetery company's problem at the end. Anyway, this is an isometric view of the cemetery ordered by the directors of the company in 1848. They ordered a few coloured copies, none of which I've ever seen. I don't think the History Centre's got any, and about 500 black and white copies to give to potential investors. It's what we would call promotional material these days. It was drawn by Bevan of York, as I've said, and it shows the lodge and the chapel built, as well as some gate posts and gate hangings. These are the gate posts, and these still exist halfway down Springbank West. It's not where they were originally, as you saw on the lithograph. They're at the corner of Princess Avenue, Springbank West and Springbank. But they moved them. I'll tell you about that in a moment. Yes, designed once again by Cuthbert Broderick. It was heavily influenced at that time by Auguste Pugin, and you can tell the ecclesiastical heavenward stuff on the top and the gargoyles further down the post. Definitely a nod to the Gothic. And at first the company showed great attention to such detail. At one point they wanted a watchman's hut built, and it was felt that it should be in the style of a Gothic cottage. It was never built due to costs. This is a copy of the original design of the lodge. Cuthbert Broderick, I'm sure you've all heard of Cuthbert Broderick, won the competition to design both this, the chapel and the gateposts, and also helped to design the layout of the cemetery. And it was his first commission. He later went on to become a very famous architect. If you've ever been to Leeds, you'll see Leeds Town Hall, you've seen the Corn Exchange. If you've ever been to Scarborough, he designed the Grand Hotel. But this was his first work. This was his first job. I think he got £50 for it, which was a lot of money in the 1840s. I'd also like you to note the cross on the turret. A nice image. Very nice image. There's about 3 or 4 images of Old General Cemetery Lodge. It looks really good, doesn't it? But every superintendent who lived there wanted to move out, because it was not because of it being in the cemetery. It's just that it had bad damp. It didn't have a damper, of course, so it had damp problems. It was rather small when you lived in it. I'm not entirely sure that there was a kitchen. It definitely didn't have any watercourse at that time, so it was, yeah. So they all wanted to move out. Even though it was rent-free. Right. So you've noticed the turret, and you've noticed the cross on the turret, and then it disappears. And that's because in 1877, the cemetery company installed a clock for the benefit of passers-by. You don't get that these days, do you? But then they installed a clock, and the clock cost £5 to be installed. Yeah. That's a postcard roughly around about 1900, where you can see that they haven't built up on Princess Avenue yet, and just across the road was Botanic Station. Right. There's the old chapel. Taken in, as I say, 1977. There's some, I don't know. It could have been taken earlier. Because the roof's still intact. But it's definitely taken by a guy called John Rumsby, who worked for the city archives at that time. But that's another story. It was built on an octagonal basis, as you can tell by the roof, and it was built right up against the field drain which separated the cemetery from what was to become Welbeck Street. And because it was built there, its foundations were somewhat flimsy, and within the first 10 years it needed significant repairs, and it gradually became quite disused. It was built with attached catacombs to the west and east of the chapel to cater for the different denominations. The catacomb burials were over £1,000 each at that time. There were only 3 burials sold as catacombs. You might go to Highgate and you'll see the Egyptian catacombs and you'll think, but London was a lot bigger and its clientele would be quite happy to afford that. In Hull, well, we're small fish really, aren't we? The chapel had structural problems, as I've said, insufficient foundations, and it was last used for funerals in 1950. The chapel furniture was sold off, all the pews were ripped out and sold off, but many things failed to sell, so they were auctioned off, and there's no record of how much they got for it, but I think it would have been a few pounds at best. It was closed completely from 1960 onwards because someone set a fire in it, and it was finally demolished in 1981. There's a story behind that because the Hull Corporation, Hull Council at that time, during their renovation of Hull General Cemetery, did say that they were going to keep it as a folly, and then they didn't, and then they knocked it down. Right, this is a view looking up Springbank West towards Chandler's Avenue. It's pre-war, pre-First World War, roughly about 1911 to 1913, and it was them, the Council Lane tramlines. I've included it because you can see how the cemetery was blocked off. They'd never built a wall, they built a palisade of wood because it was cheaper initially, but then it's not cheaper in the long run because it constantly needed being repaired. A wall would have been better. Most of the Magnificent Sevens have walls around them. The fencing, of course, needed constant maintenance, and eventually, when the cemetery went into decline, it simply fell to bits where it stood. I remember large gaps in the 1960s, and quite a bit of it went missing in the bad winter of 62, 63. Yeah, there's a story about that as well. Right, here's a map with my inscriptions on it so you can get some bearing of it. The line of Harmers Avenue, line of Lewis Street, so Springbank West, Princess Avenue, Newell and Toffs Lane, so it was known as Newell and Toffs Lane before it became Princess Avenue. Newell and Toffs Farm, there's a line, two lines there drawn site of Champlands Avenue, Collar Monument, etc. I've included that map because you might notice just above the cemetery, land to be taken for the enlargement of the cemetery. Yes. So the cemetery at this point looked to be wanting to expand and gain an Act of Parliament to allow it to compulsory purchase the land to the north. It also still had 7 or 8 acres undeveloped to the west. It was planning for the future. And the future did look bright. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but the future definitely looked bright. There was another reason why they also went for this Act of Parliament to actually compulsory purchase that land. That's because Hull City Corporation at that time was going for an Improvement Act of its own, in which they believed, quite rightly, that the Hull Corporation was going to compulsory purchase the cemetery. They knew that they couldn't be compulsory purchased if they already had an Act of Parliament saying that they were, what's the word? I can't remember the word, consolidated or something like that. So that the corporation would have been hamstrung. And they were, because it was a race between who could get the Act of Parliament to quickest, and the cemetery company won. So that didn't help their relationship with the Hull Corporation, and we'll come to that in a moment. So, as I said, they were looking to expand, and this was when they were at their zenith. The next year, in 1855, all intramural burials, that is burials in churches or chapels and their respective vaults, and the burial grounds, so Castle Street, Trippett Street, all those non-denominational, Anglican, Methodist, non-conformist, Catholic, none of them could carry on burying within their vaults after 1855. It was illegal. So at this moment, Hull General Cemetery stood at its zenith. It was the only game in town, effectively, apart from the Skullcoat cemeteries and Drarpool, Headon and Drarpool Cemetery on Headon Road, which is not the Headon Road Cemetery, what you know. It's a small grass patch now, but Headon and Drarpool Cemetery, which was opened in 1852. In 1855, Hull General Cemetery was the business. It really was. So why did it fail? They weren't good businessmen, we'll leave it at that. There was 4 external factors that it couldn't do anything about. There was a decline in the death rate from 28.8 per 1,000 in 1868 to 11.7 per 1,000 by 1928. This was related to public health reforms, better diet and living standards, and a natural fall in mortality from infectious diseases. At some of the AGMs of the cemetery company in the 20th century, the company board complained about such improvements. It was obviously affecting their business. Life expectancy at birth also increased. The commonest time that a person died now was in old age, and death, although a personal tragedy, was now seen as a more natural end. The second factor was the rise of cremation. It was beginning to be seen as a more sanitary end to burial. It was cheaper as well, and it appealed to those who feared premature burial, and there was quite a lot of people who feared that. And it was legalised in 1902. The first one took place in Woking in Surrey in about 1880. They had a trial run and they bent a horse, and that took 3 hours. So they thought, oh, body's a bit less, so we'll see how it goes. Hull Corporation, incidentally, was the first corporation to actually have a crematorium, a municipal crematorium, and that was opened in 1901. Right, Christianity was the third factor, and that was in decline. There's no doubt about that. Since the high point of the evangelical movement, it began to fade in the 1850s. And this factor was not helped by the next element, which was World War I. As a result of the carnage of the First World War, church attendance and belief in God decreased the longer the slaughter went on. It's estimated that 1 in 8 of soldiers of the 6 million soldiers of the British Army died. That's a hell of a number. It's incredible. But we've all seen the cemeteries in France and Belgium, so we know the rows of white headstones. This increased amount of death led to it losing its shock value. Mourning and funeral customs and attire changed rapidly, and the government during the First World War was definitely worried about people wandering around in mourning attire because they thought it'd be bad for morale, which it would have been. Also, many of the people killed in France and Belgium couldn't be returned home to be buried. So it's been said that the Victorian way of death was itself buried under the weight of mass deaths by the First World War. However, there are 3 other factors that were specific to Hull General Cemetery. Right. Legislation. Edwin Chadwick's report on poverty for Parliament in 1842 had looked at burials and funerals. He had advocated the government should nationalise both the burial of the country's citizens and also the funeral businesses. Well, that didn't happen. The government, of course, didn't want to go that far, but it did pass the Public Health Act of 1848, and this placed the onus for public health on local authorities. Further legislation was passed throughout the 1850s, following on from the Metropolitan Act of 1850 that closed down the burial places in London that were seen as unwholesome and problematic. Various orders in council, enacted by Parliament, closed down church and parish burial grounds throughout the 1850s, and as I've already mentioned, in 1855 it was Hull's turn. So effectively at this point, the Hull General Cemetery was the only game in town. The 1850s legislation, although primarily aimed at sanitation and housing, also gave the local authorities the powers to set up their own boards of health, which included a burial board. In Hull, the relationship with the local board of health was cordial at first, but quickly soured. At one point, the secretary of the local board of health actually sued some of the company's directors for libel for what they'd said in the newspaper. He lost, and I'm sure that made the relationship even better. Competition. In 1856, the company leased the 5 westernmost acres of the cemetery's grounds to the corporation to start a borough burial ground. This is now the original part of Western Cemetery. This was the culmination of negotiations between the local Board of Health and the Hull General Cemetery regarding the sale to the corporation of the cemetery. The corporation couldn't meet the price, so eventually a lease was arranged with the cemetery company, building a new chapel, laying out and maintaining the grounds, and doing the interments. In fact, the borough simply paid the lease and the cemetery company did the work. This extension was originally to accommodate the parishes of Holy Trinity and St Mary's. However, these parishes had lobbied long and hard for their own burial ground. And in 1861, when Castle Street was closed, the church authorities acquired the land of what was to become Division Road Cemetery from Sophia Broadley, who held a grudge against the cemetery for their late payments to her brother. When her brother had died, she had inherited his assets and she'd also inherited his debts. This was her revenge. At about the same time, in something of what I would call a hissy fit, and this really was stupid, the company chairman, William Irving, backed by the board, took exception to a resolution passed in the council. And you've got to remember, most of these directors of the cemetery company were also councillors, so he was sat there listening to this. So he was in the council chamber, and he didn't like what someone was saying about how other burial grounds were cheaper than General Cemetery, and they probably were. Anyway, didn't like it, came home, wrote a letter saying, if that's the way you feel, you can buy the lease out and you can have those 5 acres. He sent the letter off, then he told his fellow directors what he'd done. His fellow directors must have thought, oh my God. But they agreed, all right, yeah, you're doing that. And the whole corporation wrote back and said, are you sure this is what you want to do? And of course, the Victorians were great in humility. Of course, that's what I want to do. And the whole corporation snapped it up. In fact, they just paid the cost. So General Cemetery sold their 5 acres for what it cost them to lay out and the land originally. And suddenly, they had a competitor at the western side of them. So they couldn't expand to the west. Hissy fit, yeah. The cemetery company then failed to invest. It was involved in protracted negotiations by the land north of it, the compulsory purchase, and this was priced at £160 per acre. The original land from Broadley cost about £292 per acre. So this was about 10 years later. So it was a good deal. However, the cemetery company had managed to block their copybook with the owners of the land to the north by, when they first laid out the cemetery, they sent their workers in there because they thought they had a word-of-mouth contract with the owner, and they chopped down his orchard. He wasn't impressed. He got his solicitor involved. They withdrew. The cemetery company workmen withdrew. Anyway, there was bad feeling. The owner of the land to the north, he died, but his wife kept the grudge. And so when they said, we've got a parliamentary order, we can buy your land, she just ignored them. And she ignored them for 4 years. And the Parliamentary Act for the compulsory purchase was only viable for 4 years. And so eventually they let that slip. So now they were blocked. They couldn't expand to the west, they couldn't expand to the north, Princess Avenue, to the east, and to the south, to Springbank West. They were stuck. And the only way a cemetery company in those days could make money was selling new graves. If you run out of land, you're in the business of a slow death. So, this is the map from the Cemetery Burial Register showing the part that they leased and then sold to the corporation in 1862. From the period that the company allowed competition by the corporation, its AGMs are strewn with allegations that the corporation was making a loss on its graves and that the ratepayers were being swindled. However, through this same period, the directors were still paying themselves a hefty dividend of 9 shillings per share to the shareholders. And there is substantial evidence that the company was also trying to sell the cemetery as a going concern to the corporation from at least the 1850s onwards, but these negotiations never progressed very far. Incidentally, that map is upside down. That's Springbank West, and that's, so it needs to be swiveled round. It really threw me when I first looked at it. That chapel's not there. Anyway, this is an image taken from the Hull Daily Mail of March 1907. And it shows the land that Hull General Cemetery was selling to a builder and also the Hull Corporation for both shops and the road widening. And a row of shops was built on that stretch there for both shops, and they're still there to this day. And some of them don't look too good. In 1906, the company signed a covenant with Hull Corporation for the sale of its Princess Avenue frontage for 25 shillings per square yard, plus £700 from the corporation to pay for the refurbishment of the destroyed buildings. You may notice the lodge, as its turret cut off, those knocked down, those knocked down. Yes. This again failed to materialise. They really didn't get on with Hull Corporation. They really had a bad problem with them. So again, they sold this land to a local builder for less money than what the corporation offered. At an extraordinary AGM in 1901, once the builder had come up with the money and handed it over to the cemetery company, in 1909, extraordinary AGM, the decision was made to make an extraordinary payment of 30 shillings a share out of the capital they had gained from this sale. There was no longer any talk by this time of investing for the future. The company and its shareholders knew the game was up. A nice little graph. The decline in the number of burials that the cemetery handled is evident from this graph, showing the burials in the cemetery by decade. From a high point in the 1880s, it shows a steady decline. From 1968 to 1972, I think it handled 8 burials. So, still later in the 1920s, they cajoled the corporation to help pay to move the entrance site, those gateposts, to a site now on Springbank West, as the corporation wanted to widen the road further. You've got the tram lines needed more space. So, then the company used this opportunity to sell the lodge. And the original entrance to the same builder, they had sold the frontage of Princes Avenue. They received £10 for the salvage value for the lodge. Remember, it cost £1,000 in 1846. They're selling it for 10 quid. It kept the freehold on the 2 westernmost units that were built on the site of the old lodge. One of these was to be the new lodge. In a letter of 1924 from the secretary to the directors, he stated there had been no response from Sir Alfred Gelder, who was mediating the sale of the cemetery to the corporation. In the same letter, he tells of having to reduce the wages of the staff simply to save £68 a year. Again, at the same time, the local newspapers are full of complaints of how run down the cemetery was becoming, and after the entrance gates were moved to their present site, many people complained to the cemetery company and the local press about the entrance moving, as many people had bought graves specifically near to the old entrance for the status of being buried there. There's a place where you'll go where the old entrance was, and just to the left as you walk into it, there's a place called the Prim Corner, and it's full of primitive Methodists, and they wanted to be buried there, and they really did kick up a fuss about those gates being moved. So, some of you may remember this. This is what's built where the old lodge was. Some of you may remember Dougleby's, the toy shop. No, I'm that old. But I remember staring in that window, gazing, some little Victorian urchin looking at the toys. What the cemetery company did was they kept these 2 units, right? And that was the cemetery office, and that's where the cemetery superintendent lived. They rented out this shop. Oh, he also lived on that as well. And they rented out that shop. I think that photograph's about early 60s. The lodge was taken down, the gates removed. By 1948, they had dismissed all their staff, apart from the superintendent and the company secretary. All grave digging was done by Western Cemetery staff. Little or no maintenance carried out. By 1950, the chapel was disused and the stoneyard had long been rented out to various haulage firms. Continual vandalism coupled with a lack of maintenance gave a neglected feel. By the 1960s, the cemetery was derelict and the company was looking for ways to dissolve itself. Because it had started as an act of parliament in a way, it couldn't then just dissolve itself. It had to go through a different process. In 1968, the last burial took place in 1972. This is the last page of the burial register. Quite different from the first one, isn't it? Note the columns are written in freehand and the sheets are no longer printed, and that even some of the details are missing from the entries. It perhaps shows more than anything how far the cemetery had fallen. In 1968, the Hull General Cemetery Company decided to register as a company under the 1948 Companies Act as a step towards liquidation. The AGM of 1970 passed a resolution to seek liquidation, and the company sold its last properties, the two shops I've just shown you, at the corner of Princes Avenue at an auction. They sold them for £2,700, and that money was needed to pay the legal costs for liquidation. They were bankrupt. They had no money whatsoever. This photograph is taken from the Hull Daily Mail in 1973, and the image was accompanied by the headline, and I love this headline, "Clean up in sight for big Hull eyesore." Jim Johnson, the West Hull MP, raised it in the House of Commons during a bill on land use. And the Conservative government at that time, a young chap called Michael Heseltine, responded for the government. And Michael Heseltine said, "There's nothing we can do, because it's down to the cemetery company to liquidate itself, and then we can do something." And the cemetery company at its last AGM passed the following resolutions, quote, that the Hull General Cemetery Company be dissolved, and, quote, that the Hull General Cemetery Company be wound up by the court, and it was finally liquidated as a company in 1973. Hull City Council, ironically, after many years of refusing to buy it, even when the company were pleading for them to do so in the 1940s and 1950s, did eventually buy the site for £5 without any firm plans for its use. In 1975, the council decided to, and I love this word, redevelop the site, which in the past usually meant destroying most of the stones and levelling the ground. Anyway, a campaign including Philip Larkin and John Betjeman, Sir John Betjeman, who was the poet laureate at that time, began with the aim of preserving it for its historical and artistic merit to Hull. Hull Council at that time were deaf to the siren song of heritage and totally ignored it. In fact, I have a copy of the letter what Philip Larkin wrote to Councillor Woodford, and Councillor Woodford replied back saying, "Thank you for your letter, it's noted." Yeah, anyway. However, the campaign was slightly successful in that there was approximately 5,000 headstones in there at that time, and the council only destroyed 4,000 of them. There was a part of a campaign to actually preserve the most important, and they got a Department of Environmental grant of £60,000, which they wasted on destroying the headstones rather than laying out the ground. Don't get me started on this. Anyway, so eventually it turned into a park to some extent. So as John Claudius Lowden had suggested all those years ago about the fate of cemeteries when they become disused, when full, become a park. The council are now sorry. I've spoken to many councillors over this, and they're all apologetic and saying it wouldn't happen now, and I maybe believe them on a good day. Well, I mean, that wouldn't have happened in York. York have always taken a very positive view of heritage. Hull have always taken a very negative view of let's knock down something what's old, because we can put up something new, but we'll have to knock down in 30 years' time and put something else new up there. And, I mean, you're talking about knocking down Prince's Quay and Prospect. Oh, anyway. Right, as I said, the council now, sorry. Friends of Hull General Cemetery, a pressure group, try to preserve what's left from neglect, decay and vandalism in a period where money is tight. It's a long job with few rewards. However, surprisingly, we feel it's worth it. So please check out the website, the Facebook site, to see the latest news on this fight to protect this site, which, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to know anything about Victorian Edwardian society and you want to see it in situ, have a walk around that cemetery. That's it. Thank you.
Any questions? questions for Pete while he still has the stage? Yes.
Fellow presenter, thank you very much. I noticed a lot of the trees are very close to the tombs or gravestones. Are they under the tree preservation order?
Unfortunately, it's a conservation area, so the trees are protected. Even though 85% of them are sycamore trees, which, as you well know, seed all the time, and seeds drop into the vaults, and they manage to split the stones, and then the ivy gets in, and that splits it further, and the blackberries get in, and they split it further. And I've pointed out to councillors that some of these trees could be quite easily taken away, and there would be no harm to the heritage aspects, but these stones cannot be replaced. You can always plant another sycamore, but money's tight, and they'll only go in there and take a tree out if it's fallen down, probably taking down a couple of stones as well with it.
Yes.
You mentioned 2 or 3 times the issue of drainage on the site and beyond as well.
Yes.
And also the steam engine.
Yes.
Did the company take any measures before they started burying people there for drainage of the site?
Oh, yes.
And secondly, was there some kind of sump that the steam engine was taking water from, and where did they pump it to?
It's a good question, but I can't give you the categorical answer to that last part. But yes, the first part was, yeah, they drained it, they dug deep drains, they did a test dig of 14 foot down and found no water, right? Once they'd done the drains in. So the drains were working, right? Having said that, where the water was going, I would think it's being pumped into those drains and then pumped into Derringham Bank Dyke and Spring Ditch, which were running alongside both sides of Springbank West. So I think that's where the water was actually going. Whether I'm right or not, I don't know. But they did do test digs, and they said that they dug down to 14 foot, recorded in the newspapers and recorded in the mini books. They dug down to 14 foot and the ground was dry before they hit water. So it's unusual. You think Springbank. There's a clue in the name, really, isn't it? Spring, there's water there. But the spring was at Spring Head. Sorry. Does that answer that?
Yeah, it does. But it's another question that I'll talk afterwards.
If you look at, once again, if you go to a whole history centre, they've got a large ledger, the compartment books, where it puts down all the burials and who's buried in them. And there'll be blue lines running through, and that's where the drains are. And they haven't dug graves on there. They're free. Any more? I don't know about the Bishop of Hull complaining. I know there was quite a number of people who were complaining, saying that it would be detrimental to the site of Hull General Cemetery. But it was never used for burial, that part. The burial started. There was always, if you went into the cemetery in its heyday, you'd have walked in through those magnificent gates. Was the lodge. Just behind the lodge was a large flower bed, right? And to the right there was the place where the work took place, the workmen's huts, the dead house, all that. So, and then if you went to your left, that would be where Prim Corner was, and then the burial started from Prim Corner onwards. So all that bit in front of the cemetery, what now is Prince's Avenue frontage, it was never used for burial. So it wasn't like, I mean, I doubt very much whether it was ever consecrated. I would think it'd be unconsecrated, because the consecration, James might know more about this, but when he consecrated the ground, I think what the bishop has to do is actually travel the circuit with holy water, and then it's consecrated. And don't think that was, well, I know it wasn't, it was never consecrated, that. Oh, I'm getting off easy now. Yay!
One more round of applause, please. I get to do my usual wrap-up at the end of these heritage talks. So for everyone who has attended, thank you very much for attending. And if you want to catch our next heritage talk, like I mentioned at the start of this one, these talks happen every other Friday at lunchtime. So our next talk is on November 14th, which is being hosted by the Hull Civic Society. They're doing a talk on a beautiful sailboat called the Garthpool, the last ever British deep sailing sailboat made by the British Navy, which sailed from Hull in 1927 and never came back. So if you're a big fan of Hull's maritime history, which is one of the reasons we're now one of the top 25 places to visit in the world in 2026, yay, then please do come to that talk, hosted by Ian Pearson, head of the Civic Society, so should be fantastic. I'll say my usual spiel at the end of this. At the end of these talks, if the talks about cholera outbreaks and cremating horses hasn't put you off your food. We do have a cafe to get yourself a wonderful bite to eat or a drink to kind of unwind before you go back out to the very blustery, by the looks of it, and cold outside. This is part of our 600th anniversary project, and we have quite a lot of events that have gone on over the course of the year, and a lot of these heritage talks as well that have progressed, so please keep an eye out on our website, social media, for things that are coming up. And as Pete mentioned at the beginning of his talk, and I intend to mention as well, this is a very expensive building to maintain. It's £1,000 a day to keep the Minster running, which does catch up. Like many places of worship, we have to do much bid writing and such just to keep our heads above the water. So if there's any way that you can donate to us, please go to any of our donation points by the entrances or exits of the church. There's also been a dish put just underneath the tower there. So if you have anything that you can spare to help preserve this building for future generations, because it is such a gorgeous building that deserves to be kept, then please do donate. Thank you, and hopefully we see you again soon.